You see these AI apps and stuff like that people use, and I think the programs that they build on some of the better ones are like perfectly fine, you know what I mean? But you're not going to get, like, it's not going to help you on a competition day. It's not going to critique your technique. It's not going to help you with your mindset and stuff like that as well when it comes to approaching competition. And I think that is something very similar that I would highlight with respect to our model, in the sense that this will never plan a competition strategy for you. It will just maybe give you some information that is useful in your coach's bucket alongside everything else to help you make the application of the art of coaching a little more informed and perhaps a little more systematic if possible. That's kind of the intent behind it, at least.
Hi, Ian. It's my pleasure to have you on Evidence Strong Show. If you could briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, Alex. Thank you very much for having me on. It's my pleasure. My name is Ian Darragh. I guess I have a bit of a mixed background. So I have a PhD in exercise physiology. My PhD was mostly focused kind of around the domain of trying to identify almost different biomarkers of different training status. So resistance trained, endurance trained individuals. Before kind of getting into sports science, I was an athlete. So I was a reasonably decent national level Olympic weightlifter in Ireland. I did a couple of international competitions as a junior as well, a couple of junior national medals, a couple of senior national medals. So like an okay strength athlete, which got my interest in sports science. When I was an undergrad, up until still kind of now, I did a lot of coaching as well. So a lot of Olympic weightlifting coaching for probably about 10 years, a small bit of strength and conditioning stuff as well. And I now currently work for a large hospital network here in Northeast Pennsylvania. I work as a researcher in a sports medicine department, kind of essentially working with large scale electronic health record data looking at the influence at the moment now mostly of malnutrition on surgical outcomes. So again, kind of integrating some of that physiology stuff and nutrition stuff a little bit with some data science too. So,
And the paper is about powerlifting. So how did it come to be?
Open Powerlifting is an extremely well maintained powerlifting database. I'm sure many of your lifters, particularly anyone who competes in powerlifting, are familiar with it. But whoever runs that website, I don't actually know the individuals by name or anything like that. They do an extremely good job of kind of curating the database and maintaining it. If I recall correctly, I think it's updated potentially daily. If it's not updated daily, it's updated weekly. And they make that data free and open source and available for download as a CSV file. And so that was how I kind of came up with the idea of working with this database. And I kind of iterated through a few different ideas, trying to come up with something, partially looking at the literature, partially just kind of playing around with different ideas for a couple of months. And then, believe it or not, I actually came across an Instagram post. It was just I can't remember who posted it, but it was just a small little infographic that was talking about how much you jump between lifts and basically strategizing, when you're in a powerlifting meet, how much should you jump between first attempt, second attempt, so on and so forth. And I was like, okay, this is actually something we could potentially look at here. So the idea that I kind of crudely came up with was, I have this database. I kind of diluted it down into some specific contexts, and I was like, let's see if we can potentially quantify or at least explore with some degree of detail the relationship between how much you decide to jump between two subsequent attempts. So if my opening attempt is 100 kilograms and I take my second attempt at 110 kilograms, I've jumped 10 kilograms. Can we look at how that influences the probability that I will be successful on the attempt that I'm jumping to? So if I make that 10 kilo jump, what is the probability that attempt will be successful?
This is perfect because they're predicting or they're trying to come up with reasonable attempts and jumps for the competition. This is part of the art of coaching. So the coach develops relationship with the athlete so that in part they can predict when the athlete is more likely to make the next attempt and what the jumps should be. And here you are taking a big data set from many athletes, thousands of athletes, and trying to see whether we can actually statistically calculate what the jumps are. And if we do a specific jump, what is the probability of hitting the attempt for females and for males. So
yeah, and that's probably something to touch on, in that, like, one of the things that's really important to mention is that for predictive models to be useful, they often need a really large amount of data. One of the things I'll comment on as well is the fact that we filtered it down to IPF, International Powerlifting Federation competitions, for a couple of reasons, but one of them is that they have very strict technical rulings. So you have, I think in the study we had around 96 or 93,000 lifters total, which is an insane number of competitors.
yeah.
But because of the rule set, we can also say within reason that the lifts were judged under somewhat consistent standards.
Could you explain what building a model is?
I can talk in detail about the particular type of model we did maybe later down the line, but what you essentially see as a model, and you'll see them in research studies, they are in essence something kind of like a generalizable equation. So what I mean by that is the sense that we have built this model today and we've reported the equation of it, there are a bunch of factors in that equation, such as the body weight of the lifter, the age of the lifter, the sex of the lifter, and so on, as well as some constant values. And the idea there is that it's kind of like a calculator, essentially, in that if you took that equation and you had values for yourself, I know my age, I know my sex, I know my body weight, I know my jump attempt size, you can plug them in and you'll get a result, just by using the constants. So a model is essentially like a pre-built calculation. It has inputs, and it has inputs and it has an output. And obviously the output is generally what you're kind of trying to, the desirable thing you're trying to predict if it's a predictive model. And then models also have essentially quality. You have good models and bad models. There's a very famous statistics quote. I can't remember who it's attributed to, but it's the idea that all models are terrible, but some models are useful. So something to kind of note is that there will always be a detraction from reality in any statistical model that you build. So even if you see something that is, and there are a number of parameters, essentially you'll build a statistical model, you'll assess its quality based on a number of parameters. So you can tell, is this model good at predicting the outcome or bad at predicting the outcome, in essence. But even models that are very good at predicting outcomes are not perfect. You'll never have a model that, particularly in this circumstance, let's say, I wouldn't call it a criticism, but one of the skepticisms we've received from kind of friends of mine who are practitioners and stuff like that is the idea that, oh, so you think that like this will make a decision for coaches? And the idea that is like, absolutely not, because there is still a black box component here. This is more about understanding the relationships and giving some maybe quantifiable benchmarks that you can come in with some baseline information and then add that to what you intuitively know about your athlete through working with them, or just again through your coach's intuition. It's about informing decisions instead of making them for you. So I've kind of gone on a bit of a tangent there, but maybe to bring it back in together, a model is essentially, it's a machine. It has a number of inputs and it's built, and you'll build a model sequentially. So you'll start with one input. So for example, when we developed the model for this study, we had the output decided, which was whether a lift would be successful or not. And then we had our first input, which was the jump size between attempts. So we just started with two things: the jump size, whether it's 10 kilograms, 20 kilograms, whatever, and the probability of a successful attempt. And we looked at that and we go, okay, how good is this alone at predicting our outcome? And then we added something in. Well, what about whether it's different between squat, bench, and deadlifts? Because the amount you will jump is different between whether the lift is a squat, bench, or a deadlift. So then we added in the lift type, and that was a factor. Then we added in what we've termed the attempt transition, which is not a great term, but that's essentially whether you're jumping between the first and second attempt or the second and third attempt. So how far you are within each given lift. You add that in and you can see if nuance kind of is extracted further on down the line. So that's essentially how the model was built, by sequentially adding in different factors that we had data on that we thought were relevant, evaluating the model's parameters, but then also trying to balance it off how easy it would be to interpret the model. So there are other factors we could have added to our model to make it a better predictor, but it becomes too confusing to understand how it's producing results at that point, which means it's more difficult to use those results in practice. So again, that's kind of that trade-off between complexity and interpretability that I was talking about at the beginning.
My understanding for now is you found this data set, you decided to look at the jumps and the probability of success, and then you tried to include different variables one by one, adding them to the model and seeing whether that the results will be different and whether the model is a good fit. How do you call it?
Yeah, it's essentially like, does it become better at predicting whether a lift will be successful or not? And I mean, I think contextualizing that probably makes it a little bit easier to understand, in the sense of, if we think about just considering how much you jump alone, that can be useful, but the amount you jump, it doesn't matter if you're a 6'8", 200 kilogram male or a 4'9", 48 kilogram female. The amount you jump will always be bigger on your squat and your deadlift than it will be on your bench press. For some people, a 50 kilogram jump on the squat may be achievable, but most people will not make a 50 kilogram jump on the bench press. So if you go, oh, well, this model only considers how much you jump, but the amount I jump is very, very different between my bench bench press, let's say, than my deadlift, or the amount I jump is very, very different between my last opening or my last warm-up weight and my opening weight, or my third attempt, or so on and so forth. So it's just like the best way to think about it is like, because like the way you kind of think about it when you're building the model is, oh, but what about this situation? And do I have a variable that I can contextualize that to? You know what I mean? But what about older lifters versus younger lifters? Does the effect stay for older lifters? Okay, I should include age as a variable in the equation to see if that changes the prediction. What about, males versus females? What about squats versus bench press, and so on and so forth? So the main predictor is this jump size, but then we have all these other variables, and the statistical term is a covariate, but it's essentially like caveat, a contextualizing factor, But obviously the more you contextualize, the more difficult it can become to just generalize. You know what I mean? The more nuanced you make your model, the more difficult it is to say how it applies to everybody, to some degree. So there is, as I've kind of mentioned, a balancing act between, making sure that you explain enough that the information is useful, but you don't explain so much that you can't say, like, you can't give a statement that most people can then take information from to use in their training or their competing practices. Essentially what we used is what's known as a non-linear logistic regression approach. And again, you'll see this with statistics all the time, and that, like, you get all these fancy terms, but it is actually something that can be simplified. So regression is a term that you see thrown around a lot. Anytime you see the word regression in relation to a statistical model, it simply means a model that's looking to predict something. Logistic then simply refers to the fact that it's using a logic function which basically is designed to look at binary variables. So yes, no. So in our case, was the lift successful or not? A lift cannot be kind of successful. The judges either give you 2 white lights or 3 white lights, or they don't. So when we say logistic regression, it's a model that's designed to predict a yes-no outcome. Good lift, bad lift. That's kind of the logistic element of it. Non-linear, how regression works in its most simple form is that you have your data already collected or provided to you or whatever, and you come in with a preconceived relationship between your variables. So probably the best example to think about is linear regression, which, even if you've never heard that term before, you've probably actually seen it. If you've ever seen a scatter plot with a bunch of different points and exactly a slanted line that's either going upwards or downwards, that's linear regression. And how linear regression works essentially is, I think there is a straight line relationship between my 2 variables that I'm interested in. Let's say the amount I jump in a lift and the probability of that lift being successful. I think the more you jump, the more likely you are to be successful, or the more you jump, the less likely you are to be successful. And you draw that line the best you can based on how the data is shaped, and the quality of the model is essentially assessed based on how well your data orbits around that straight line. So if I drew a straight line for that example and all the data was just very, very close to the line, we'd be like, oh, this is a great model, because this shape that I've drawn, which is explaining a relationship, a very linear relationship, more is better, less is worse, my data conforms to that shape, therefore it's a good model. We used a non-linear approach, and the reason for that is a lot of relationships are non-linear, and all non-linear means is the line is not straight. And there are actually plenty of examples in sports and exercise science of non-linear relationships that a lot of people might be familiar with. Anyone who's ever seen the results of a VO2 max test before, so essentially an aerobic fitness test where you run on a treadmill, you ride a bike, usually for 12 to 15 minutes, the test gets progressively harder minute on minute, and you track oxygen consumption, what you'll see is oxygen consumption increases in a straight line, and then it reaches a plateau and it stops. So it's almost kind of like a truncated S shape or something like that. That is an example of a non-linear relationship. Oxygen consumption increases. When you reach VO2 max, it gets stuck. So that's an example of one we see in sports and exercise science. And we did the same thing here. So we said we're building a model to predict this outcome of good lift or bad lift, and we're assuming that this relationship is non-linear, basically meaning that there will be some kind of curve in the relationship. And we can kind of get in, when we get into the results, it's a better way to kind of explain it. But like contextualizing it, the best way you could describe it is increasing your jump size to some extent will potentially increase your probability of a successful lift up into a point. But obviously you can't jump forever. You know what I mean? So if you say, oh, if I jump 2 kilos versus 5 kilos, I might have a better chance of making the lift with 5 kilos, but you can't do that into infinity. Where you go, well, if I jump 8 kilos? Well, if I jump 18 kilos? Well, if I jump 25 kilos? Anyone who's ever lifted before is going to go, okay, that doesn't make sense. There comes a point I add 200 kilos, it eventually levels off. That's essentially what the non-linearity aspect of our model is kind of meant to describe. The fact that like you may see an increase up into a point in benefit, but through logic, there has to be a ceiling where the relationship begins to kind of change. So in its most simple form, think of the relationship between jump size and the probability of lift being successful is a squiggly line of some description. It's not a straight line relationship. And again, that just conveys a little bit of complexity there, less so to do with the model and more so to do with the phenomenon itself. But I think anyone who's lifted before will have some intuitive feeling of that. Anyone who's actually loaded a bar up to a 1 rep max or a 3 rep max, or competed in some kind of way, will understand that feeling to some extent. So there is some logic behind it, which I think makes it a small bit easier to understand. But I do realize that element of the study is quite complex and difficult to digest for sure.
No, I think the practicality of the study is at some point it makes no sense to make this jump. So the jump is too big, or it can be also too small. But let's focus on too big. So if you are coaching through the competition an athlete you do not know personally, or your relationship with this athlete is very short, so that you don't have experience in jumps, there is probably a number for this particular athlete, or because they are a male in this weight class and it's a back squat, there is a cutoff number that you shouldn't cross in this generic, let's say, situation, only because you don't have this experience and relationship developed.
One of the things I will say is, like, I think definitely take anything when we talk about specific numbers here as an approximation. I think that the things that are important to note are, what is the shape of the relationship in terms of, like, in the case of, I guess, kind of spoiler alert, in the case of all of the lifts, we found that like increasing the amount you jump up into a point will increase the probability of your lift being successful. But there is an inflection point where that begins to change, and your probability of lifting. So in other words, you can jump too much, which I obviously is, I think, something that's not going to blow anybody's mind. But the shape of the relationship is approximately similar across lifts, but the ranges are different, which again, so you need to know things like the range with which I can jump between squat attempts is larger than the range within which I can jump safely between bench press attempts. When it comes to individual lifters, then I think that is probably the biggest part where like knowing your athletes comes in, because like, I mean, anyone who's been around lifters before, I knew people of similar weight classes to me, or maybe marginally heavier, who could make enormous jumps that I just, you know what I mean? Like for me, if I was doing squats, say, like anything more than 10 kilos would be very, very considerable for me to jump, even from warm-up weights. I just, it messed with the way my squats felt, and I would misgrew things and stuff like that. So I had to be very meticulous in my warm-ups for squatting. Whereas I knew people who could come in 70 kilos on the bar, 2 reps, 140 kilos on the bar, 2 reps, 180 kilos on the bar, 5 sets of 8 reps. And you're just like, right, yeah, I can't do that, that kind of, or I like getting to their work sets as quickly as possible, so, and those might be, and you might see that across lifters with very similar profiles in terms of similar 1 rep maxes, so on and so forth, similar body weights. So that is obviously where the nuance of that coming in, and knowing that relationship will be consistent across lifters, but like the ranges might vary by lifter, and some of the factors we explore is meant to assist in understanding factors that may influence those ranges, essentially. I know we've probably kind of jumped ahead a little bit by talking about that, but yeah, that is in essence kind of what we were trying to do, and I think we've accomplished it to some extent. I guess the very boring result that I will mention at the beginning is that our model, so we separated, again, just to reemphasize, we did a male and a female model, and again, that was partially for interpretability and partially just to avoid the male data overly influencing the female data from a predictive standpoint. But our two models had there's a model parameter, it's the only one I'll talk about, which is called sensitivity, which is essentially an indication of how good the model is at predicting a successful lift attempt. And they had a sensitivity for the male model, it was 87%, and the female model, I think, it was 88%. So that's, if you're rounding it up, I'll be nice to myself and round it up. 9 out of 10 successful lifts in both models were predicted by the model correctly. You know what I mean? So 9 out of 10 times, if you make a lift, this model will have predicted that you were going to make it, you know, whether you're a male or a female. Before we kind of maybe talk about the jump effect size stuff, I think there's two things on the descriptive side that I thought, when we were discussing the results as a research team, we were kind of working together on it, I thought were very, very interesting. Some of my colleagues didn't so much, but I thought they were useful to go into. The first thing we did is we did on the descriptive level which lifts had the highest overall success rates. So squat, bench, and deadlift for males and females. They're slightly different between sexes, but I thought it would just be interesting to note. So I think for both males and females, the bench press and the bench press had the lowest success rate. So I think it's around low 60%, like 62 to 65 kind of percent, give or take, for males and females. I think it was slightly lower for females. So irrespective of attempt or anything, you've only got about a 60 to 65% chance of making a bench press lift. In comparison, the squats and the deadlifts were both in the mid to high 70%. So people tend to, you know, miss. The rate of bench press success is about 10 to 12% lower for both males and females than either of the other lifts. And it's something I think that comes across consistently throughout our results, is that the bench press is a bit of a bizarre animal in terms of some of the results we see. But I think that is anecdotally known in the powerlifting community. I think there's a term people use, poverty bench, which is basically you've got someone who's a good squatter and a good deadlifter, but just for whatever reason, an absolutely terrible bench presser. And, you know, I squat 250 kilos and I can't bench 110 kilos, you know, kind of situation. But I thought that was interesting. The other thing that I think is worth commenting on is that irrespective of anything else, what lift you're doing, your age, anything like that, the probability of a successful third attempt was around 10 to 12% lower than the probability of a successful second attempt. So all other situations being equal, people tend to miss more on third attempts. With the probability of a successful third attempt is around 50%, and the probability of a second attempt is a low 62, 63%, you know, kind of. And those numbers will vary marginally between males and females, but generally speaking, so all other factors being equal, you know, you have a 1 in 2 chance of making a third attempt in comparison to a second attempt. I thought that was interesting now. And there is some other literature, might be a study by Kyle Travis. I think it might be 2019 study. We cite it within our article, but they looked at, if I remember rightly, I think they looked at World Championship, like IPF World Championship play, I think top 10 or something like that. And they did estimate that you will see from first attempt to second attempt to third attempt, like a progressive decrease in the rates of a successful lift across all three lifts. But I might be misremembering the authors of that study, but it is cited in our article. I just thought it was interesting. There are factors at play there, in the sense that obviously people might take chances on their third attempt more, and therefore, you know, are more likely to miss. But I think that is something that's useful to know for coaches, in that like all other factors being equal, before you start thinking about how you're handling your lifter and, you know, planning their lifting day strategy, there is kind of a natural progressive decline in success rates across attempts. And that's useful to know, because I think it is useful for informing. It is information that can be used to inform attempt strategies, you know. But that's all just some descriptive stuff that we found before kind of getting into the nitty gritty of the model that I personally thought was actually useful findings from the study, but it could just be me.
No, makes sense. If coaches are coaching for a long time, they have this feeling that whatever jumps you can make between the first and second, the second and third, the jump should be smaller, or that you have to accept that the probability for lifter to make this lift happen will be lower.
Yeah, and it's potentially something where if you're going to make an ambitious jump, it might be worth doing it after your first attempt, but before your third attempt, you know. And I think that's something that people might intuitively do anyway, particularly when I was competing. But there was a lot of these phrases that got kind of thrown around, but I think it was like, first attempt is to stay in it so you don't bomb out. Second attempt is to win it. And then the third attempt is kind of in your back pocket if you need it, you know. So like, whatever your best score of the day you thought was going to be, try to get it on your second attempt, so that, you know, you have a conservative opener, you're going to stay in the competition, you're going to register a total, take your chance on your second attempt. If you miss it, you've got another chance at it, great. If you make it, hey, there's a bit of wiggle room here, you know, we can get a few extra kilos on the board for placing, PBs, whatever, you know, that sort of stuff. And I guess I think that kind of that anecdotal strategy does also seem to line up a little bit with what we've estimated, like with that result from our study. So in some sense, probably validating what at least some coaches are doing, but also it helps to emphasize that point and that you can quantify it with numbers to say that this is a real thing. You know, it helps helps emphasize that it is important to consider that those sort of factors when it comes to planning competition strategies. Maybe I guess we could talk about the jump size effects, which are the main aspect of the
Yes.
model. Then, so I guess kind of talking about it, I guess we have to kind of partition this by sex a little bit. But what we found, generally speaking, for both sexes, without some minor details, generally the squat and the deadlift kind of responded the same in terms of jump attempt size, in the sense that for males, for example, you can see like anywhere between 5 to 20 kilograms on both the squat and the deadlift. You will actually see an increase in your probability of a successful attempt if you jump anywhere between 5 and anywhere under 20. And again, that's going to be where, you know, and I think those are quite reasonable jumps that people tend to make in on those lifts. And obviously the individual variability is what decides, because there's still quite a big range between 5 and 20 kilos, but that's where individual circumstances kind of come into play in that middle zone. Generally speaking, you will see declines in the probability of success in squats or deadlifts if you are a male with jumps over 20 kilos, and that effect was a little bit stronger on third attempts in comparison to second attempts, which I think is, you know,
So,
by the time you reach your third deadlift, you're pretty tired. Jumping 20 kilos is a tall order. For males on the bench press, jumping less than 10 kilos, generally speaking, between attempts will improve or you'll have higher success if you jump less than 10 kilos. But you will see that like there's a really sharp drop off with larger jumps on the third attempt again in comparison to the second attempt. And that's really just a more granular manifestation of what I was talking about previously when we talked about third attempt success rates in comparison to second attempt success rates. For females, you'll see kind of something similar on the squat and deadlift, in that like you can see, you know, increasing success rates, but the range is smaller. So generally for females, based on our model, between 9 and 11 kilos or 8 and 11 kilos in and around is where you will see kind of, you're likely to see an increased probability of success in comparison to males who were 5 to 20. So that range is tighter, but the principle is the same. Something we saw with females, and again, this is probably something that you would see a little bit in anecdote, in that like the extent to which females see an increase in the probability of bench press success is very small. So I think we said anywhere, it's like something like between 2 and 4 kilos or something like that, as estimated by the model. And I mean, yeah, and again, I think we saw like a marginally lower probability of success rate on the bench press for females as well, and particularly on third attempt size, like any kind of moderate. You'll see it in one of the figures in the study. If I was to pull it up, just for anyone who wants to kind of read the study, all two of the people who want to read this study, in figure 4C, on the right hand side, you'll see kind of the female bench press result is like a complete, it's like a waterfall, you know what I mean? It comes up within a very narrow range and then drops off very hard. It's difficult, you know, it is in theory a similar relationship to what the males see, but it's considerably more pronounced, and it's difficult to know why that is. I mean, it's consistent in the literature that females display lower estimates of upper body strength relative to males, even in comparison to like lower body strength differences. I think Tommy Lundberg from the Karolinska Institute has a really nice large scale study where they just compared different athletic kind of traits between males and females. And I think you see things like very large differences between males and females in terms of things like punching power and so on and so forth. So I only hide that to say that that difference is pronounced across other like upper body strength and power related kind of movements between males and females. But I actually, from what I understand, the mechanisms behind that are not well understood. I think there's some stuff around muscle mass distribution and stuff like that, but I find it difficult to believe that that is the whole story. But it is something that's identified in our study as well. It is in some ways consistent with other similar athletic style events, but it is difficult to understand why that relationship is much more profound in females compared to males, but it is there. So I guess kind of wrapping that up, that section of it, it's to say that squats and deadlifts, generally speaking, have similar relationships for both males and females, in the sense that larger jumps can be tolerated, and larger jumps will, within certain ranges, increase the probability of successful lift. So you can actually, to some extent, jump too small. Like when we talk about the upper limits of the jump size in this study, like, you know, I think the upper limits are more representative of physical limits there, in that like you can literally only lift so much. Like I don't think anyone ever missed a 25 kilo jump because they just didn't believe hard enough, you know, that kind of thing. It's probably just 25 kilos is really, really heavy. But when we talk more within those nuanced small ranges, like the difference between, let's say on a squat or a deadlift, the difference between making a 2.5 kilo jump on a squat versus like 8 kilo jump, 6 kilo jump, 5 kilo jump, something like that, that is probably where that kind of comes into play. And again, like that is purely speculation by me. I don't fully know, but I think that is something that could be a factor of just like giving people an appropriate challenge. That would be my guess. Yeah, and it's probably a good time to point out in that, like, I think because you see this, I mean, it's a slight detraction from us in terms of we're building a model that's like more around competition strategy, but like, you know, a machine can build you a decent training program, but a machine can never coach you. You know what I mean? Like you see these AI apps and stuff like that people use, and I think the programs that they build on some of the better ones are like perfectly fine. You know what I mean? But you know, you're not going to get, like, it's not going to help you on a competition day. It's not going to critique your technique. It's not going to help you with your mindset and stuff like that as well when it comes to approaching competition. And I think that is something very similar that I would highlight with respect to our model, in the sense that this will never plan a competition strategy for you. It will just maybe give you some information that is useful in your coach's bucket alongside everything else to help you make the application of the art of coaching a little more informed and perhaps a little more systematic if possible. You know, that's kind of the intent behind it, at least.
I think it's also useful to have you build models separately for females and males. And anecdotally, coaching females and males is slightly different. So if you can see it in the model too, then you can take it in and keep it in mind in terms of how do I even talk about the possible numbers. And if I have a lifter who is starting, how should I gauge the standard way to coach the jumps in the warm-up or in the approaching PR and so on. Because if you do things for the first time, you don't have preferences, you don't know. So you have to start somewhere.
Yeah, and I mean, this isn't something we looked at, but something I did, and it's more applicable again to weightlifting than powerlifting. So we're really getting tangential now. But one thing I noticed in weightlifting, and a little bit, I coach mostly males throughout my career, just through happenstance. I worked with some females, but mostly males. But something I did notice from, like, because the club I coached at was different from the club that I trained at. So some of the stuff I noticed with the girls that I trained with was they would always open at competitions like way closer to their max than I would. You know, like I would train with girls who might have, like, say 82, 83 kilo snatch, and they'd be opening at like 78, 79 kilos. Whereas I might have like 125 kilo snatch. I'm going to open at like 115 kilos. You know what I mean? Like way, way further away, but they were much more comfortable, like opening really heavy and then making those more precise jumps, where I was like, I need to open really light and make bigger jumps, you know? And that was something that, I mean, again, it's pure anecdote, and it's weightlifting instead of powerlifting, but that was one of the factors that did inform separating those models was just me being like, well, I have this experience of, like, whether it's physiological or psychological, it's like just seeing girls approach it differently to how guys do, you know, and being like, okay, that, you know, because whether it is physiological or psychological, it may still manifest in the data if it's something that's kind of very consistent. Obviously that's pure anecdote, but I do think there is something to it, you know, to some degree. You know, we did some linear fixed effects, and essentially, again, fancy statistical terms, we included some things in the model that we did not make nonlinear, just because, again, just makes things more complicated, makes things harder to interpret. So we were like, we'll just keep these as linear because it's much easier. It's a much more straightforward interpretation. But the caveat there is that you take it with more of a grain of salt. Essentially, it's not as a precise finding as some of the stuff we've talked about already. So the three things we included in there were the first attempt weight, so the opening attempt weight, essentially. So what your opener is, body weight, your exact body weight, you know, as opposed to your weight class, and age. And we included those as linear effects just to see how they also interacted with the probability of a successful attempt. We found opening weight had a negative association with the probability of lift success, which I guess kind of make heavier you open, the less likely you are to make subsequent lifts. So again, there's probably a sweet spot there, but that's potentially not surprising. Body weight had a positive association with lift probability success. So heavier lifters tend to make more lifts. Again, that's within reason, probably something that makes sense. And likely these relationships, if we were to do very granulated analysis of them, would have some kind of a non-linear relationship. But how I would interpret them within the context of lifters here would be like, it's probably a good idea to fill out your weight class. So what I mean by that is, if I lift in the 105 kilo weight class, it's not really valuable for me to be 100 kilos. I would probably have a better chance of making lifts if I weigh 106 kilos, don't have breakfast, weigh in at 105, happy days, that kind of situation. So that would be the way I would be interpreting those relationships for now. Similarly, it's useful to probably have a conservative opening weight. And very interestingly, we did not find that age meaningfully influenced successful lift probability. I actually kind of thought you would either see something on either end of the spectrum where younger lifters would miss more lifts because they're perhaps overly enthusiastic, or older lifters would miss more lifts because they're old. But if you look at that figure in the study, I think it might be figure 5. It's essentially like a horizontal line, so there really wasn't a relationship there. Now that could also just say that even if younger lifters are more, and being anecdotal here, say chaotic in their lifting attempt strategies, they might be young enough to do that. Whereas older lifters may kind of learn to become conservative as they get older, and therefore, that might be why that happens. Something that's probably very late in the game to mention, we did account for individual lifter variability in our model. So all that means is essentially, to some extent, we tried to capture the fact that, like, if I'm in open powerlifting and I have 3 competitions, there's a relationship between those 3 competitions, and there is a relationship between the attempt strategies that were applied by me within those competitions. So I might be different from people who, through all of the circumstances, look similar to me. In terms of guys who similar height, similar weight, similar lift numbers, all that sort of stuff, there's still going to be differences. And I think we estimated that effect to be somewhere between 12 to 14%. And what that kind of just means is that, like, it doesn't strictly mean that, like, the values range that I've given you can be estimated to vary between 12 to 14%. Instead, it just simply says that, like, the individual lifter is accounting for, like, differences between lifters is accounting for, like, kind of 12% of the error in our model, essentially. So difficult to interpret, but it is accounted for, which again just adds some precision to our estimates when we generalize it. We're knowing, like, which competitions are paired to the same lifter over and over and over again. But I think those are the last findings of the study, at least.
Awesome. Huge study. If anyone is brave enough, they should go and at least look at the figures, because I think that's helpful. You have lots of beautiful figures there. So that is something I would recommend. Now, I have 2 questions to finish. The first one is, what is your favorite lift?
My favorite lift. So when I was, I'm retired from weightlifting now, but when I was weightlifting, my favorite lift was the split jerk. Believe it or not, I was a bit of a peculiar athlete in that I very rarely missed jerks. I would very often miss cleans. I wasn't particularly strong, so I generally knew if I completed a clean, I was going to make the jerk. So I would finish the clean, a very difficult clean. I get to the top of it, I'm like, oh yeah, here we go, here's the fun part. So I know a lot of people like the split jerk, but I really enjoyed it. Now it's probably something like a back squat or something like that. It makes me feel like I'm still vaguely athletic, but those are if I can give you 2 answers, those are my 2 answers: split jerk and back squat.
That will work. And last question is, where people can find you if they want to look at your work or see what you're up to?
Yeah, so I'm on ResearchGate, Ian Darragh, Darragh, and I am on LinkedIn as well under the same name. I have an Instagram. Instagram is probably the best place to contact me if you're looking to, say, get a copy of the study, or if you are looking to just reach out with a question or anything like that. That is the best place to find me. Bean Swole is my Instagram. Bean as in the legume, and swole as in I once was swole. So if you're trying to find me there, that's probably the best best place to contact me. Otherwise, LinkedIn or ResearchGate. I think the article is available for free on ResearchGate. If not, you can request it and I'll provide it to you. If people are looking for full texts of the article, I'm happy to provide that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ian. Pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah, no, the pleasure was all mine. Really enjoyed it.